All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for Pass the Reins, Shifting Decision-Making Power in Philanthropy, co-hosted by NCRP and the Indie Philanthropy Initiative. My name is Caitlin Duffy, and I'm Senior Associate for Learning and Engagement at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. NCRP was founded to amplify the voices of nonprofits and grantees in conversations about how philanthropy works. And since 1976, we've advocated for philanthropy that benefits and engages marginalized communities and advances systems change. Today's conversation aligns with our new strategic framework that some of you may be familiar with, and our goal of more intentionally driving resources to social movements, including the grassroots groups that are most overlooked and underfunded by mainstream philanthropy. And in this moment in history, with the rising tide of neo-Nazism and white nationalist violence, it's vital that funders use their grant dollars to bolster grassroots groups and to protect threatened communities, and on those communities' terms. So there are many ways that you can accomplish that and further democratize philanthropy, but today we're lifting up community-led grant making as a central best practice. And I'm personally really excited for this conversation because A, I want to honor the legacy of the funding exchange and those who've been practicing community-led grant making for decades. And also B, I serve on the board of the Diverse City Fund, which is a small social justice fund in DC whose grants are decided by a rotating panel of local change makers of color. So I know there'll be a lot of food for thought today as we learn from our 4 featured models and panelists. And I want to introduce you all to Ariane as our co-host today. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Indie Philanthropy Initiative?
Sure can. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Caitlin. My name is Ariane Schaffer. I'm the director of the Indie Philanthropy Initiative. I'm also the communications director at Kindle Project, and I'm really excited to be on this call today. I'm firstly amazed at how we can feel that we're in community over the internet. I think there's something really wonderful happening here, and seeing how many people signed up for this webinar is especially inspiring and exciting. So what we do at the Indie Philanthropy Initiative is that we're funder educators and funder organizers, and we're most excited about working within the field of philanthropy to help shift towards more values-aligned giving practices. And that can look a lot of different ways. One of those ways is what we call community-based decision-making or participatory grant-making. We're so excited about shifting power in philanthropy, like the title of this webinar, and in all of the different methods that we educate and are inspired by, they all have an element of power shifting in philanthropy. We see that as like a central thing that we need to focus on within the field in order to be more creative and more democratized in the field. So we're very passionate at Indie Philanthropy about how grant making gets done. And we're also really passionate about storytelling. We feel like there's a lot of really powerful learning that happens when we hear each other's stories so that we can then remember them. We can bring it back to our communities, to our boards, to our bosses, to our colleagues to say, okay, how can we take inspiration from that story and then look at our own grant making and how can we tweak it a little bit. So one thing that I would like to remind everybody on the call is that you're going to hear some incredible stories today, really inspiring ways that funds are being moved and decisions are being made. And all of these have nuggets of inspiration that are all applicable to your grant making. So Indie Philanthropy can help you out with that. So can NCRP and all of the people on the call today. So I'm just really excited to be a part of this, and I'm psyched to hear the stories and to hear your questions. That's it. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you, Ariane. Thank you, Ariane, and also to our webinar co-sponsors, Grassroots Grantmakers and GrantCraft, which is a service of Foundation Center. And to prime today's conversation, I'd like to invite Jen Bokoff from GrantCraft to share about the participatory grant-making guide that's in development. So, Jen?
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm thrilled to be on this webinar. It's a very timely topic and really great to see such a good response. So GrantCraft is a service of Foundation Center that shares the practical wisdom of funders to improve the practice of philanthropy. And it started in 2001 with the idea that funders build experience by learning from their peers. So we do a lot of bite-sized content like blogs and videos and infographics, but what we're probably best known for are our guides. And currently, I'm working on developing a guide about the what, the why, and the how of participatory grant making. And we're doing it because such a resource doesn't actually exist in the field yet, even though it does build on some recent research that Ford Foundation has led and some ongoing practice sharing by members of the Human Rights Funders Network, which was formerly IHRFG. So the GrantCraft Guide will provide a clear definition of participatory grant making. It'll share a bunch of examples of what it looks like in the context of different organizations. It'll explore its benefits and challenges, and it will also offer pragmatic advice from current practitioners. Our research is being led by Cynthia Gibson, and to date, it's yielded some really great examples about how funders and the participants in their grant-making efforts have approached the complexities and opportunities of this funding model, which really informs how it can better address needs, deepen relationships, empower participants, and surface innovation. And GrantCraft actually is a very global lens, and so it's been really fascinating to see how participatory grant making has been embraced by more grassroots and locally based efforts, especially by foundations who define part of their focus as human rights. And you'll see some of those pictured on the screen. And in particular, because this is a domestically focused webinar, I've been so impressed by US community foundations. And one of those is the Brooklyn Community Foundation right in my backyard, and you'll hear from them shortly, who offer some of the best examples of inclusive community-led grant making. So I could talk forever, but you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear practitioners. So let me just tell you the last couple things you need to know. The guide is launching next spring and summer, kind of a slow rolling launch as we do in philanthropy. And there's still opportunities to help us shape the content and frameworks of the guide. This webinar is actually going to help do that. So on the screen is how to be in touch with me. And I really want to hear from you, whether you do participatory grant making now, or if you have curiosities to inform what we address. So please pass along any and all thoughts, feedback, examples. And with that, I'll pass it back to Caitlin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. So with that, let's get a sense of what kind of organizations we have represented among the registration for today's webinar, including their organization type and what part of the country they primarily serve and what knowledge and skill level they're bringing to this conversation. So first off, you'll see that we have a lot of nonprofits, a lot of private independent foundations, and also community foundations and other philanthropic support organizations similar to NCRP and the work that we do in this sector. You also see we have a lot of folks who are working nationally and on the western side of the United States, and you'll see the breakdown of some of the other primary regions served on this slide. And lastly, as far as the knowledge and skill level that folks are bringing to today's conversation, we have a lot of people that are learning, or still beginning to learn, or starting to learn, or have some idea of how this model works, or how this approach to philanthropy works in practice. We also have a number of folks who are advanced or who are even experts in this, so we're excited to tap the knowledge and skill that you all bring to this conversation later during our audience discussion. And feel free to also share in our Q&A and chat boxes. So join the conversation. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A box where you can pose questions for our moderator and our speakers. You can also use the chat box to pose questions to a larger audience of the webinar and share resources or links and whatever else might be relevant to the conversation. So today's agenda, we'll be hearing some context from our moderator, Jennifer. We'll be doing some introductions of our speakers, then we'll jump into our moderator discussion. We'll do a brief attendee poll and then have an audience discussion before we close things out. And if you're a Twitterer like me, join us on social media using hashtag #ShiftPower. You can also tag NCRP and Indie Philanthropy at Indie Funder. And I have these hashtags and handles, including those of our speakers, that'll be listed at the bottom of many of our slides today, so you can follow along. I'm excited to introduce our featured speakers to you all today. We have Maria de la Cruz, Associate Executive Director of the Headwaters Foundation for Justice, whose pronouns are she, her, hers. We have Teresa Trujillo, Community Partner with the Colorado Trust, whose pronouns are she, her, hers. We have Leanne Stegmeyer, who's Vice President of Communications and Strategy at the Brooklyn Community Foundation, pronouns she, her, hers. And Cortez Wright, who served on the Activist Grant-Making Advisory Panel with the Third Wave Fund last year. Cortez uses the pronouns they, them, theirs. With that, I'll turn it over to today's moderator, Jennifer Meir, who is General Coordinator for the Building Equity and Alignment for Impact Initiative, who also uses the pronouns she, her, hers. Jennifer, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Can you just give me a nod that you can hear me okay? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to moderate this conversation with a number of practitioners here on the panel. And also, I know that several of you who are also listening in are practitioners as well. And so really looking forward to bringing you into the conversation during the discussion. So I also have the honor of giving a little bit of context and helping to ground us in this conversation as we get going today. And I come from organizing with a number of funders and movement partners who are working to democratize philanthropy across both grants and investments. So just wanted to give you a sense of, where I come into this conversation from. And also have the exciting announcement that one of the groups I'm working with, the Building Equity and Alignment for Impact Initiative that you see on that screen, is about to launch an activist and grassroots-led grant-making fund later this year, and we will definitely be providing more resources on that as things develop. So stay tuned. So I think to ground us, we want to just acknowledge that this is a conversation in which we're talking about a lot of different models, a lot of different processes, and also a lot of different terms. What we mean when we talk about shifting power in philanthropy, we have a number of names for it and a number of different ways that it's manifesting. So we may say that it's community-led, activist-led, that it's participatory, that it's democratic, that it's resident-led. So we just want to acknowledge that there's a number of terms, but what do we really mean by those terms? Maybe we can get to the root of that a little bit today. We also want to acknowledge that in different institutions, it can mean fairly different things. So within a private family foundation, it might mean having an advisory board or bringing activists onto your board and into the decision-making process. Or for a community foundation, like the Brooklyn Community Foundation that we're going to hear from, it might mean actually shifting that decision-making completely over to residents. So just want to hold that we're talking about a number of different things, and we'll try to tease that out a little bit in the discussion. I think one of the things we just want to name that is the part that ties all of this together is the fact that these are all approaches and interventions to shift power within philanthropy and shift how we determine where resources flow. And the other piece that ties them all together is that it's about a level of transformation that we're still adjusting to, I think, both within philanthropy and our broader work for social justice, which is a transformation around who's in control, who has power, who makes decisions about resources. So regardless of what model we're talking about, what name we give it, that's the root of it. That's the nugget of it that we really want to learn more about. I want to honor that in this political moment, it feels like this is a really timely conversation, and there's activity around it, and there are funds being built. And it makes a lot of sense just with our heightened consciousness and the feelings that we have about this political moment. And at the same time, there's a long history of working to claim what we need and agency and shift what has been historically a very unjust system and an unjust process in the sector of philanthropy. Another thing I just want to name, in part because it's something that I'm personally care about and involved in, that it's about something bigger than just grants. We are going to have the conversation today mainly around grants, but we are also talking about how foundations are invested and how they move other forms of capital through their investment strategies as well. So I'm just going to segue a bit and say, today we want to talk about participatory grant making as a fundamental strategy to shift philanthropy in better alignment with our goals of our social justice movements and the needs of our communities. We aim to inspire all of you and all of us to think about pathways to democratize control of resources, as well as to dig in more deeply on the practice, the questions and the challenges and the learnings that we get from that practice. And we want to acknowledge, I think somebody, either Caitlin or Ariane said in the beginning, that we all sit in different places in our different institutions. So where you might sit might be that, you could never have an activist-led grant making board, or you could never completely shift control. And we want to acknowledge that, and we want to say there are places in which that critical work in our sector is happening, and how can we move more resources to those spaces? We all have different roles to play in this process, so we just want to acknowledge that. Another thing we'd like to acknowledge is that while moving money and shifting who decides how money moves is a critical part of this conversation, it's actually not the only part of this conversation. There are additional social and political benefits to having participatory and democratic spaces and moving money in different ways, including having agency, shifting our relationship to money and capital and our trauma around that. There's a sense that we actually need more spaces to practice how we make democratic decisions, how we move forward based on consensus, that there's a lot of benefit beyond that, just how the money moves, and we want to lift that up as well. So I'm just going to close with just also grounding us in this moment politically. I know for me, just some of what's going on in the world, what's happening with Hurricane Harvey in this moment, there's a lot that we're trying to process. And Caitlin named it in the beginning of the conversation and said, in the face of regressive policies, clear rise of extremism in terms of the white supremacists in our country, political violence, disruption, militarization. In the face of all of this, why is it important that we have this conversation? Why is it important that funders, particularly those who care about equity and justice, embrace this kind of approach to grant making? And, when I think about this, I think about how some of this conversation is actually fairly fundamental on a certain level, in that I don't like to attribute this to any one movement, but I feel like a number of our movements have helped us with the phrase, nothing about us without us. And that's sort of a core value that we hold. And that piece of the conversation feels like really true and honest, and we know that. And I think that's a core part of why funders should care about this. But the piece that I think in this particular moment is really relevant is to think about all the conversations we're having around white supremacy and how it relates to this discussion. And I just want to name that, I think probably many of us know this, but white supremacy is not just about extremism and violence. It's not just about, what we're seeing in terms of this moment on TV. It's about control and the expectation that some of us earn the position to broker and determine the social change and how resources flow on behalf of others. And really, if we are genuine and authentic and serious about wanting to shift the legacy of systemic and historical racism in this country and confront white supremacy, then we really need to be serious about this conversation about who has voice and agency and control over how resources are allocated. So I think that's all the context I want to give. I'm really excited to just dig into the conversation, and I just want to say that as serious as that grounding is, I'm also really excited about the potential. What does it mean to shift in a way that builds upon the collective wisdom of our communities, and to shift into a relationship in which we are a part of the social change, in right relationship with it, instead of trying to control it ourselves, and to build who's around the table of making those decisions in a way that represents all of us. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to have a little bit more of an introduction to our speakers today, which is really exciting. So I think I'm going to start with, give me 1 second, sorry, I just got to get my notes together. Maria I wanted to ask you, beyond your bio listed on the webinar event page, what are 1 or 2 things that the audience should know about you?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. Thanks, Jennifer. 1 or 2 things that the audience should know about me is that I actually come out of the grantee community from the Headwaters Foundation. So I was a grantee for 3 different organizations, and that is part of the reason why I'm so excited to be on staff here at Headwaters. And then I think the second thing I would love people to know about me is that I'm also the board chair at Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice, which is also an amazing organization, really doing groundbreaking grant making, capacity building, both here in the United States and beyond. So thanks for having me today.
Great, thank you. And Teresa, the same question to you, 1 or 2 things that you'd like to share with us. And Teresa, you're muted. I'm sure Caitlin can help us, but just give you 1 second.
I'm unmuted.
Great.
And so I think one of the things that's important to know about me is that I'm a native to the area that I serve, the 10-county area that I'm responsible to in Colorado. I was born and raised, and my family's been here at least 9 generations. And so I think it's significant that those kinds of ties, and this is very highly relational work. And so those relationships that are sometimes my relationships that I hold, sometimes relationships that are held historically or among ancestors are really significant in the power building that's happening in this work. And the second thing I think that's important to know about me is I'm the oldest of 7 children, and so I consider myself a lifelong community activist. I started organizing my family when I was young, and have been fortunate enough to organize in a lot of different capacities. But some of the best learnings that I bring to organizing work really are born out of organizing in my family and organizing in my home community.
Thanks, Teresa. And Leanne, 1 or 2 things you'd like to share with us?
Hi, I'm going to just mostly talk about my organization, which I've been at for 6 years now. So Brooklyn Community Foundation is kind of a baby in the community foundation world. We were created in 2009, and in 2014, under our then new president, Cecilia Clark, we worked together to create a 6-month borough-wide community engagement project called Brooklyn Insights. And through that process, we not only created a new strategy for our discretionary grant making program, but we also created a new vision and a new mission for us as a community foundation, which included a commitment to racial justice and systemic social change. So that work really laid a great foundation for us and the work that we continue to do today with resident-led grant making, as well as youth-led grant making. We've been sort of continuing to learn, and we always kind of position ourselves as coming from a place of learning and growing. And we work in such a large and complex place that always learning is really essential to us achieving success.
Hey, Leanne.
Sure.
That's great. And so I'm going to take away one core thing about you is that you really want to learn and evolve, but maybe one other personal thing about you that we should know. We're just doing a little bit of a personal.
Sure.
Beautiful art behind you.
So I'm the director of communications here at the foundation. So I don't have my hands too deep in the grant making, but I love to talk about it clearly. And I've been a Brooklyn resident now for 15 years. So again, it's a place that takes a long time to get to know really well, but has a lot of pride.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And Cortez, just 1 or 2 personal things about you that we might not know from your bio.
Sure. I guess one of the personal things is that I'm a huge Wonder Woman fan. I have a tattoo on my wrist. I don't know if that is clear at all. And then the other thing is that I've been very intentional over the past few years as I've made different transitions in my work of really wanting to demystify philanthropy and sort of redefine what philanthropy is when it comes to communities and sort of disconnecting it from this, I feel like really sort of restrictive and not transparent idea that is something that sort of happens with large organizations with large budgets and large amounts of money and people who can write giant checks, that it can actually be a grassroots effort for people who can write small checks in large quantities and things like that. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and shift into our discussion. So, you know, I just want to say that each of you is sitting in a slightly different position in terms of your relationship to a participatory grant making process. Some of you are in an organization that's just started that. Some of you have been doing it for a long time. You have different models and processes. So I think what we would like to do is just to hear from each of you a little bit about what the process looks like in your institution, in your community. And Maria, if you would like to start and tell us a little bit about yours, that'd be great.
Sure thing. So Headwaters has been around for about 34 years, and for much of that time, we've actually done what we call here community-led grant making, and at times we also call it activist-led grant making. And recently, in the last couple of years, we brought in a new model called the Giving Project, which that model actually was originated by Social Justice Fund Northwest about 7-8 years ago, and we brought it here at Headwaters as well. What we were really interested in is continuing to build upon that community-led grant-making model, but also to bring in some popular education to really kind of build that analysis from the get-go in a multiracial and cross-class space. So for us, the nuts and bolts of our process are really first bringing together about 20 to 25 people who, like I said, are multiracial, cross-class in the state of Minnesota, which is a pretty white state to be in. We are situated in the Twin Cities, and so we are able to achieve that multiracial aspect. In addition to that, Minnesota, there's a number of Minnesotans who have a legacy of pretty great wealth, and so it's really interesting that we're bringing together poor, working class, middle class, as well as wealthy folks into the room. Through our popular education work with them, it really is taking a look at that racial wealth divide in the United States. We look at it from a personal perspective. What have people's personal histories look like, their families, where they come from, how has wealth been accumulated or not? And then we also take a look at the state level here in Minnesota, as well as the national level. So we really pay attention to a broad story about the way that race and class has really been used to divide our country and people. The next thing that we do is we actually train people in doing fundraising. So for us, it's really critical that we are training people to ask for dollars really based in a set of values around equity and justice. And so our participants on average talk to about 10 people each, and sometimes many more than that. We have some folks that really kind of go gung-ho and are talking to 20 or 30 folks. But really they're spending that time talking about racial equity in our communities and inspiring people to give. This last Giving Project, the cohort raised over $215,000 in the course of about 6 months, which is pretty fantastic. The final piece for us is that they actually go through our grant making process that we've been using for almost 3 decades. So they read the proposals that come in through Headwaters, and we have a set of criteria that's really based around a general operating framework. We recognize that a number of our grantee partners are often receiving restricted gifts from other foundations, and so we want to provide them with as flexible as possible dollars that we can. So our volunteers read those applications. We meet to decide which organizations will receive a site visit, and then they actually lead those site visits. As staff, our role is really to provide support and some training around how to do a successful site visit, but they're really leading those conversations and then bringing the information that they gather back home into what we call our final funding meeting. And that's really our final piece, is that our participants meet and talk about each and every one of the organizations that they site visit, and they make decisions using our democratic process for which organizations will receive those gifts. So this year, for example, we had 41 organizations apply through our giving project for a new fund called the New Majority Fund, and 9 organizations received 2-year grants totaling $20,000. It takes a full day and really a lot of trust in the room to be able to get to those final decisions. But at the end of it, the feedback that we've gotten over our last 3 cohorts is really that folks trust the process in the room because they've spent so much time building relationships, building community, building trust, and also understanding that there are people that are coming from all walks of life in the room, and that what they're really practicing, right, is those racial justice and economic justice values. Bringing an intersectional lens to the work has been really critical in thinking about our democratic process.
Thanks, Maria. So Cortez, we were going to pose the same question to you. And, you know, I just want to acknowledge that Third Wave Fund is actually one of the groups that's been doing this for a long time too. And so maybe it'd both be interesting to hear about your process and just briefly how it's evolved over time and what your relationship to it has been.
Sure. So Third Wave as a fund has been around for over 20 years. They're an activist led fund by and for women of color, intersex, queer, and trans people under the age of 35. So I served as one of the inaugural panelists on their activist grant making advisory panel in 2016, which was a pool of funding that was intended to provide organizations with 6 years of funding and support to sort of help organizations that are new or just beginning or that have been around for a minute but may have had some trouble accessing larger pools of funding to really develop themselves over that time. And so it was not only just funding, but also technical assistance so that people can get the resources, that the organizations to get the resources that they need to properly support their leadership and their membership. And so a part of the process for this was selecting people for the advisory panel that fell within Third Wave's mission, their ideas around gender justice, and both being inclusive of rural communities, poor people, people of color, particularly Black people, trans people, and queer people, to be not only a part of the process, but actual decision makers to help redistribute some of that power that tends to lie with people outside of those communities. And so the initial pool had over 100 applicants, and it was narrowed down to about 5 people who were all paid for their time for participating in the process. And through that process, had a hand in both determining, both reviewing proposals, interviewing applicants, deciding who would get in-person site visits, and helping to choose the final 6 grantees for the funding. In addition, because of the way that the panel was set up, it also helped to contribute to Third Wave's long-term strategies around how they deal with intergenerational leadership, where there are young people in positions of power supported by elders, and also helping to sort of illuminate areas that may, or not areas, but issues that may exist around not of having a small staff working at a fund, therefore not being able to necessarily be really in touch with or capture the pulse of what's happening in other states and other regions. And so I think one of the main missions throughout the entire, both with Third Wave, but also through this process, was ensuring that that young people had a stake in philanthropy, that young people felt like their voices were being heard in philanthropy, that they had power, that they had agency, but then also to help people build skills around what it means to work in philanthropy, to be a part of a decision-making process around grant funding, and some of the sort of hard decisions that you have to make in that process, but also what are some innovative ways in which we can think about this process. So what are some questions that people don't often think to ask when they're giving interviews for potential fundees? What are some things that people don't even think to look for when they're talking to young leadership? What are some of those areas or some of those pitfalls that people who may have been doing this work for a very long time and who may be above a certain age, and what are some of the assumptions that people may carry when doing this work that young people can sort of help break through? And so that was my experience as a panelist on the grant making panel, and then also just working with Third Wave throughout that process and previously as a grantee and seeing how their work unfolds.
Great, thanks, Cortez. So Teresa, would love to hear a little bit about your process too. And you know, in hearing you talk, it seems like you've made some real process choices and some choices around how to shift the culture of practice in ways that have really helped you to better meet the needs of your community. So just curious, the reflections on how that process and culture shift has really helped you to better support the community that you're a part of. Oh, and you might be muted.
Much. Thank you. I keep forgetting I'm muted. So the Colorado Trust is operated fairly traditionally for about 30 years, and then there was a vision within leadership to really begin to do some power shifting between how decisions were made and how money was granted in communities. There is shared within the Colorado Trust an understanding that the money that we are stewards of, it belongs to the people of Colorado. And so how do we make decisions about that collectively as communities to access those resources? While that was very new work for a more traditional foundation to delve into, it wasn't work that was necessarily foreign to communities that I'm working in. Or perhaps there is a continuum of how different or new this work is in communities. I come from a part of the state that was very significant within the Chicano movement in the 70s and 80s. Colorado is also a state that, following the civil rights movement, was actually ahead of the national average for both Blacks and Latinos in housing and income and building wealth, and those have been eroded, particularly in the 80s and 90s. That is eroded, and those communities are actually faring poorer than they did when the civil rights movement began. And so there is, but there is, I think, because we're talking about parts of the state that are have had a lot of organizing done, or there is some history of organizing. It is not in the community, certainly within the region. And so for communities, a lot of this power building is an extension of work that's been done over many decades. And there is a significant amount of work that has to be done within the institution to meet communities where they are.
Hey, Teresa,
so,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're just having a little hard time hearing you. Can you just speak into your speaker a little bit more directly? Sorry, it's great. We just want to make sure we can hear you.
Sure, happy to. And so the work that we're doing is really applying community organizing principles to power building in communities so that they can access resources that belong to them, but so that they can also do the work of advocating as a community to get their needs met beyond financial resources that are necessary within those communities. Because the Colorado Trust is a health equity foundation, the work of equity is paramount in communities and in the work that we're doing on the ground. And so there is a lot of work that we do around really gathering the community's analysis and deepening that analysis and widening that analysis within the community. And so that's a significant part of power building in the community. But there's a lot of work that's being done. I was hired along with a cohort of folks at the Trust to to really replace program officers, and we're community organizers. And we're working in communities where we're embedded, and so we live in the regions that we serve. And this was also, I think, a huge step for the foundation. There hadn't been that kind of remote staff structure within the organization, and we continue to work to find the best ways to support one another as remote workers in different regions of the state, so that we're not working in isolation, but that we're really building networks regionally, or really supporting existing networks that exist, and strengthening those, so that we can do really generational work within communities, and really inviting communities to do that generational work with an infusion of investment in people that the trust is doing, and our focus remains power building.
Great, thank you. So Leanne, you started to tell us a little bit about what that process has been like for the Brooklyn Community Foundation, but I'd be really interested to hear what it's been like, given that it's a newer process for you all, that you've just recently gone through this evolution. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about, yeah, what have been the key learnings just in its newness of stepping into the work in this way?
Yeah, so we ended up focusing on neighborhoods because that was one of the core takeaways from our big community engagement process, and just how important neighborhoods are in a place like Brooklyn, and but also how quickly they're changing, and how residents feel like they're losing their voice and their say in the future of their communities. So for us, it was really important that we make an investment in neighborhoods, but we also want it to be conscious of our role. And at the time we were moving to a new neighborhood in Brooklyn, Crown Heights, which is in central Brooklyn, and is a neighborhood that has a lot of history to it. In fact, has a movie currently in theaters called Crown Heights. And we wanted to start in our own backyard with this work. So we've done this now for 2 years, but the first year was really just about relationship building, which helped us kind of introduce ourselves to the community. Again, we're a young organization. We had some grantees working in Crown Heights, but we didn't necessarily know the community institutions, the churches, the synagogues, the block associations. So it was really just introducing ourselves to everyone, meeting the gatekeepers, hearing from them who they respect and who they value as leaders in the community. And then in the first year, we really built an advisory council of residents. In the second year, we wanted to go bigger and really broaden our reach. So working with a community organizer to facilitate the process, we went into the idea of doing these visioning sessions. And so we ended up doing 3 visioning sessions across Crown Heights neighborhood, really just opened the door. We were putting flyers up on storefronts and sending direct invitations to local groups, running Facebook advertising to the local zip codes, trying to cover as much ground as possible to get as many people into the door as possible. And then from there, we used the people that had come and participated in those visioning sessions to help build up our advisory council, which was 17 members. And those 17 members reflected on what we had learned in the visioning sessions, determined what the big investment goal was going to be, and ultimately helped us design an RFP and worked with our staff on an RFP process, and then made recommendations based upon the projects that we had received. But I think for us, because we're working in this rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, we still have a lot to learn about what authentic engagement looks like, particularly with long-term residents. Crown Heights is a complex neighborhood. We have a long-standing Caribbean community, Haitian, Trinidadian, Jamaican, but we also have a large Orthodox Jewish community in the neighborhood too. So we want to make sure that that community feels like they're part of the process. And every year we're trying to get better and better at the representation of Crown Heights communities, making the folks feel like they really have, they're really being heard, and that we're continuing to open the door even more broadly to the public, because every year we do this, more people come to us and say we want to get involved. So we're always trying to think about how do we do that work better.
Great, thank you. So as we talk about each of them, the mechanics are quite different in everyone's communities and institutions, but there's definitely a thread about shifting power and putting people in a position of power that have historically been left out or marginalized. And so actually, Leanne, I was gonna have you go first. Maybe you can just say a little bit more. What in your process enables people who have historically been left out to actually participate in a process like this? It might be compensation for their time or the way that you structure the process or hire people. Just anything else you say about that?
So I think us starting not with program staff, but with a community organizer, really putting someone who's skilled at that ability to reach out and gather people and really do the type of listening and the create a format that works within the context of our Crown Heights community was important. When we were developing our Crown Heights Advisory Council, we wanted to think about how do we make this experience most valuable for the people that are making this commitment. They're doing weekend work, they're doing evening work. So we're providing meals, we're providing childcare, we're lifting up their leadership in a variety of ways where we can. We haven't yet done compensation, but that's definitely an idea that's on the table. But I think we really need to recognize and value that the residents that we're looking to make these decisions, they're really giving a lot to us in terms of their time and their commitment. And they're lending credibility and authenticity to our process, which is totally required to make sure that it works and to make sure that our investments are effective. So certainly it has a lot to do with valuing participants and listening to them for feedback, and we're constantly trying to change and improve based upon what they're telling us about their experience.
Great. Cortez, I might just ask you for quick reflections on this question as well. And I just want to call out a tension that I feel like is really alive in our sector right now around, well, it's been a long conversation looking at the funding inequities that go to particularly some of the constituents that Third Wave Fund is serving. And we have this dialogue about how there's such severe funding inequities and they often fall around racial lines and obviously other lines of marginalized populations. And at the same time, we don't always connect to the fact that actually having people at the table making the decisions might be the important intervention to actually disrupt some of those funding inequities. And, you know, when we talk about racial justice organizing, we often talk about how it's not about diversity or inclusion or just getting input, but it's really about co-creation and collective liberation. So just wondering, how do you operationalize that within the Third Wave Fund, like in the concrete ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for Third Wave, it's mostly about having a very real commitment to ensuring that not only are we actively seeking to make space for marginalized people, but that, again, we're doing it in a concrete way. So some of the things that happened during this panel was accommodating people who were in multiple time zones. So making sure that when we were scheduling calls, that we made sure that it worked for everyone in the East Coast and everyone on the West Coast and everyone in Central Time Zone, so that everyone could be present, checking in with people after the calls to figure out what it was that they needed, if they felt like they couldn't be present or if people could not be on the calls, because most of this work for the initial panel, because we were separated across the country, happened remotely, with us talking to each other on camera or by phone. And so I think we all love webinars a whole bunch. And so we know how much work it could be to be on a call after a full day of work or whatever. And so making space for people in that way. I think it's also about active recruitment. I think a lot of times when we talk about, when we do talk about diversity and inclusion, there's this assumption that if you write a good enough call for applicants, that will be enough, that people will see that and think, oh, okay, I'm interested in that, I'll apply. But it's really more about organizing, actually making sure that you're outreaching to organizations that are connected to the communities that you're trying to uplift, and then working with previous participants in the work that you've done to sort of give you answers to those questions of what is it that we could do that would make our work more inclusive, that would make our work more representative of the communities that we're seeking to uplift. And so I think a lot of those things that happen also included talking to previous grantees who had received funding, and then also making sure, like I mentioned earlier, that the panels that were chosen were varied, did have different experiences, were people who weren't just in urban areas, but also people from rural communities, people who had no experience with philanthropy to people who've been working in philanthropy or fundraising in some way. And so those were some of the ways in which we tried to make sure that everyone was included.
Thanks.
Can I also interject?
Sure.
Would that be okay? And so I think there's also a piece that's important to constantly keep in mind, that so much of this is about internal processes that happen within our organization. It isn't all about the external work that we do that invites others in to being a part of the decision making. It's both about asking, who's at the table, but continuing internally to ask again and again and again the questions about, who's trying to get to the table, but but can't get there, or whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure. So it's really going deeply into our own internal processes and being willing to make the shifts necessary to meet communities and meet folks who are more marginalized and have been left out of decision making. It's about constantly evaluating that from the perspective of the organization and the internal inequities that we perpetuate.
Thanks for naming that, Teresa. And I hope in the discussion we can actually get a little bit more into that and how we need to be intentional and how we build process around that. We've had a little bit of discussion about how as we move in this direction, that's a really important piece. And that segues really nicely into a question I was going to ask you, Maria. So we called this conversation Past the Reins, Shifting Decision-Making in Philanthropy. But as we dig into the practice of doing this, we can discover that it's not as simple as just shifting who controls the money and the power. It can bring up a lot of trauma and history of really being, disenfranchised and marginalized and left out in ways that are really harmful. So I'm just curious if you can share a little bit with us what are the challenges that you face along those lines and what you've learned in that process.
Sure. So one of the first things just to talk about is oftentimes the assumptions that our volunteers have as they come into Headwaters. Again, many people know us, they're affiliated as grantee partners, things like that. But I think they're oftentimes very used to very traditional ways in which foundations make decisions, particularly when you think about the role of a board or board of trustees. So one of the first things that we really take a lot of time to talk about with our participants is the fact that our board of directors really is a cross-class, multiracial, and multi-sector group of people. There are organizers, donors, there's a broad cross-section of our society. And we talk about the fact that really when we do the work around those final funding decisions, there's, as you can imagine, some trepidation. Will the board reverse the decisions that we've made? Will they pick apart the list that we are recommending? Things like that. So we really spend some time building some trust across the organization, and what our participants come to understand really is that our board actually looks at a docket as a whole. They don't actually walk through each applicant individually, but they're really looking at it as an entire slate. And so in our history, our board of directors has never reversed a decision that our community grant makers have recommended. The second thing that I'll also talk about is, in the Giving Project, it's a cross-class group of people. And so very early on, as we work with folks, they make what we call a personal meaningful gift. So every participant makes a gift. We've had as high as a $25,000 gift come through and as small as a $50 gift come through. And so we really do celebrate every dollar that comes in the door. One of the questions that we get in our one-to-one conversations with folks about their personal meaningful gifts is, if I make a small gift, does that decrease my power in this group? We also get questions on the other end from folks who have a great deal of wealth and a lot to give, saying, listen, I'm really concerned that if I make this gift, that people are going to assume that I'm trying to take all the power in the room. And so I think what's really fantastic is that our participants are asking those questions, and we're really able to make sure that, one, as we do our popular education and community building, we actually have something we call a class cluster. So we are actually explicit. We talk about it individually about what our class identities are, and we start to build relationships across those identities. So nobody gets to hide in the shadows. And what we see across the board, whether we have poor and working class or wealthy people at the table, every single person really is able to lift up a sense of shame about messages that they've heard growing up about their class and how it's intersected with their race, things like that. So we work very hard to be able to think about, how does trust get built in a cross-class way? How does historic trauma really play out as well? So we really bring to get people together to build those relationships, and we also work with people. We do what we call caucusing. So we split up into a white caucus and then a caucus made of people of color, Black and Indigenous folks. And so we spend time actually unpacking the dynamics that may arise in the room as in a private space. And then as facilitators, we really work hard to address those as well. So like I said, nothing gets hidden in the shadows. It's really very transparent and out in the light for the community to see.
Thanks, Maria. Well, we have some great questions coming in through the Q&A. We definitely want to get more of your insight from your experiences. But before we do that, we're going to pause and just do a quick audience poll. So you see the question on the screen if you're on the webinar. It says, what does the philanthropic sector need to activate and expand participatory grant making? And there are going to be a number of options that you can choose as part of that poll. So we're just going to give all the participants a minute to go ahead and select if they have any thoughts on that question. And also, just while we take a minute to do that, I just want to remind people to please put their questions in the Q&A function. And you can also share comments or resources in the chat function. So we'll just give everyone a minute. Okay, I think we've had enough time to respond. So I think, magic. So it looks like the #1 response based on the participants is political education for board and executive leadership. And the second was sector dialogue, which is great because that's what we are hosting right now. So wonderful. I also got a note here. Somebody just chatted in. We need to have credible messengers who can build relationships with the community. So that seems like another important piece that we're making our small contribution to in this moment. So thanks for that. So I think we're gonna segue now into audience discussion. And like I said, just a reminder, please keep putting questions in the Q&A. We're gonna try to get through them. I actually have one more that I would like to pose. And Teresa, I wanted to start with getting your thoughts on this. So my question is around, it's important that we have this conversation about moving money in ways that build power and shift power and bring folks who have historically been marginalized into the decision-making process. But in some ways, money is just a vehicle. I mean, the scale of the money that we're talking about in the larger scale of the economy and the problems we're trying to face is often, quite small. So really beyond the grants, we want to talk about what are the positive benefits or impacts of moving money through a more democratic process that represents communities. What other benefits do we get by holding a process like that?
So a huge benefit that I hear again and again from folks in communities is that this is an opportunity to move out of social isolation. Because we're doing work in communities and we're meeting with teams of people and resident teams in their home communities. We're not bringing them to make those decisions, or to make decisions or to do work outside of their community. It really is the social isolation piece. They're meeting regularly, they're meeting weekly, they're gathering for meals before they meet together. And so that social isolation piece and just connecting with your community is often a piece that really keeps people coming back again and again and again. And I think it is communities discovering the power of advocacy and the power of sort of a united voice, and that coupled with the deeper analysis that helps folks really understand that these are systemic issues. Oftentimes there have been decades of blaming individuals for situations that they're in, and so the freedom that offers folks when we begin to look at social and institutional inequities and how that impacts individual lives is often so freeing from a lot of shame for folks. And so I think those are some of the benefits that come in this process that will live beyond, and that we hope will live beyond, an infusion of money.
Thanks, Teresa. Anyone else want to say anything about what they've seen in their process before we pose another question? Maria, it looks like you're nodding.
Yeah. So there's kind of been two really specific instances where we've seen the impact of the Giving Project really expand Headwaters' reach. The first piece is we're a community foundation, and so I work really closely with donors through our donor advised funds. We have a very small portfolio. One of the participants in our first cohort actually increased her giving by 30% after she did the Giving Project. And that really came directly out of the fact that she built relationships with 5 new organizations, and she walked away so excited about them. And so when we think about what that looks like, for her, it was about the dollars going out the door, but it was also about the fact that she as a white person really spent time really being cognizant about the role that she was playing in that group. And so she took the learnings from specifically the people of color in our cohort to really make those decisions. So that's one really great example of like what the ripple effects are of our work. And then the second example I have is during Standing Rock, we had a young Indigenous queer person actually here in Minneapolis. Franklin Avenue is known as the cultural corridor. The American Indian movement actually was founded on Franklin Avenue here. And she works on that street, and during Standing Rock actually worked in her community raising grassroots dollars from organizers and business owners and community activists, raised over $20,000, and then actually called me at one point and said, Maria, I need to figure out how to give this money away. Can you help? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't have the time. She actually went ahead and used our democratic grant making process to figure out which organizations she and her friends would give that $20,000 to. And so again, she, texted me and said, like, thanks so much to Headwaters. Like, you actually gave me the confidence to do something that I never would have thought of before. So as we think about like what it looks like to move money into movements, it doesn't always have to sit specifically at Headwaters. It can actually happen through community members, through their own self-determination, optimism, wisdom, making those decisions.
Yeah, thank you. And that might actually be a great segue into an audience question. A couple people have asked about the outcomes or the impact of participatory grant making and how we can sort of articulate and leverage those to talk to some of our more traditional institutions and better understand really the full impact of this power sharing approach. So anybody just want to lift up any more of the key outcomes around your participatory grant making process? Leanne, go ahead. Yeah.
So this year, our goal was to through our visioning processes, determine one key investment area. And that investment area actually ended up being inclusive public spaces. So investing in more places for people to come together and organize and advocate and continue to have these constructive conversations about their community across race, across class, across religious background. So it just showed that even the very basic work of the participatory grant making was achieving the goal that people were most concerned about, which was creating this framework for bringing people together. And I think it's particularly interesting because the community of Crown Heights where we're working is becoming increasingly fragmented. There's a lot of wealth coming into the neighborhood and a lot of development. And there's definitely a groundswell of people that want to come together to confront that, but not always feeling like they know that they have the space to go to or the framework. So like this feels for us a much longer term investment in just the very basics of bringing people together and then giving them the money to continue to direct towards those causes that are emerging.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question? Okay, then I'm going to go to the next one. And I got a note from Jen at GrantCraft that in that guide that she mentioned, there's going to be more detailed information about the nuts and bolts of each of your models or processes. So we just want to, there's some questions that are coming in around specifically how each of you set up that advisory board or do your work. So we just want to name that some of that information in the real more details of it will be shared. But maybe it would be good to talk a little bit, a couple of questions have come in around do any of you provide stipends to your grant review panelists? And also, again, asking what internal processes have happened to ensure successful community grant making. So anyone want to talk about whether or not they provide stipends or other process shifts that are really concrete that have helped to ensure successful community engagement?
I'm happy to talk about some process shifts that we've done. So through the Giving Project, one of the things that we actually implemented, even as we were really creating the architecture here at Headwaters, is we brought in community members to actually be advisors to us on this. So we really thought with them about curriculum. We thought with them about a lot about recruitment. The recruitment piece for us actually feels like the most important piece that we do as we're thinking about a Giving Project. But those folks really continue to serve. We have what we call a core team for the Giving Project now, and they serve a very important role for us. And at this point, they are now Giving Project alumni who've had that experience and so can really come in as somebody who's been through our process and give us really critical feedback that we're able to act on pretty seamlessly. So that's the stuff that our participants don't see. That's sort of the behind the scenes piece for us. That feels really important, and that group continues to grow and change. And again, many of those folks coming from community organizing backgrounds, they really understand not only the framework that we're using as far as our values, things like that, but they also really understand, how to best facilitate and support a large group of decision makers as they're making these grants and other impacts in our community.
Great. And Cortez, how about for you at Third Wave Fund, process shifts or stipends, compensation for participation?
Yeah, Third Wave did compensate the advisory panel members for their time and their commitment, which particularly given that Third Wave works with young people under 35, queer, trans, intersex, people who are working fairly constantly, et cetera, I think that is sort of a key component to be able to say not only are you going to be sort of a decision maker in this process, but also you want to make sure that your time is being valued since you are having to take time off of your other responsibilities. I think that's one of the things that people don't often think of. I think that's one of the things that people don't often think of, the time commitment for this. And so through the third wave process, we had calls every couple of weeks. We reviewed over 20 applications that were 15 to 20 pages, if not longer, reading narratives, doing follow-ups, ranking the applications that came in, really sort of teasing out not only personal, but also just concrete ideas around the proposals that we read of what was possible, what could actually be accomplished given the time frame, which is a significant amount of work. So yes, people were compensated for that time.
Yeah. Thank you. And Teresa, you can weigh in on that. I'm going to add another dimension for you because you also mentioned it and it came up in a question. So not only process to enable participation for people who maybe already have access to the table, but then how do you work on recruitment and increase that accessibility for more community members? What have you done in your process to ensure that? You were speaking to that in one of the other questions as well.
Great. So we do stipend the resident teams who are making decisions and planning for their communities. The Trust makes planning grants available for communities, and then they manage that money. We support them to identify a fiscal sponsor, and we've tried to really develop systems that meet the goal of ensuring that we're honoring the expertise that's coming from resident members within the community, and yet not sort of centering that payment piece by having tiers and so folks can determine their level of commitment to the process, and folks who are taking leadership and governance responsibilities on. There certainly are mechanisms to compensate folks for the time that they're investing in the expertise that they're sharing. And we're still learning about that process, and we're in the midst of figuring out, as communities move into their implementation grants to do some of the work that they're planning for, how do we also ensure that there's autonomy for community groups to make decisions about how they will continue that compensation, or if they'll continue that compensation for all of the roles that are involved. Some of the ways in which we ensure that we're asking questions about what barriers still exist for folks. We do a lot of work around language justice. So I will often go into a community and engage first with folks who are monolingual Spanish speakers or who aren't English speakers, and begin work and capacity building with some of those more marginalized voices before we're engaging more traditional decision makers or more traditional leadership in the community. So often there's a building of a resident team that comes kind of in stages. Language justice, really, we do a lot of, we've learned a lot, and we do a lot of training around how do we use interpretation and translation, not as a tool for helping English speakers understand folks who aren't English speakers in the room, but how do we use it really through the lens of community organizing as a tool to encourage dialogue and conversation and deeper understanding. I've run meetings entirely in Spanish that English speakers have to struggle to participate in, and so we do a lot of activities, and we try on a lot of ways of looking at power and how power is working in the room, and then how do we extrapolate and really learn about what power looks like in the community and how we do power mapping as folks are wanting to move into policy work. How do we understand systems of government at the municipal, county, and county level, even before we start understanding policy work at the state or national level. And so those are some of the things that we do to try to bring equity into the room all the time.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's participating for all the questions, and we'll do the best we can to get to them in our limited time. I'm definitely seeing sort of a theme in a number of the questions that have come in around the fact that people don't necessarily want to give up control and power and shift to these more participatory processes. So there are questions coming in about what have those conversations looked like? How have you engaged in those conversations? And I would add a dimension here. Somebody wrote, traditional foundations feel very uncomfortable giving up power. Any strategies and how we encourage them to be on board with this power shift? And one of the things I would like to name, and then I'd love to get feedback from each of you, is the fact that sometimes we talk about this as a moral framework. It's the right thing to do. We need to redistribute resources in this way. And while I think there is an element of equity and justice to this, I think we sometimes don't as much articulate the strengths of it, the political strengths, the social strengths that we get by organizing ourselves and our distribution of resources in this way. So I guess my question is, what have those conversations been like? What have you done when it's gotten really uncomfortable? And how, I don't think we can convince anybody to give up power and control just by telling them they should. So how have you navigated those conversations? What kind of arguments have you used to win people over? And Leanne, you were kind of talking about it in terms of like what you're seeing with gentrification. And this is a strategy against gentrification that has real political traction. So maybe you could start and just give us a little insight on that.
Yeah, I think whenever anyone hears that it's Brooklyn Community Foundation, their first thought is, what are you doing about gentrification? And so I always point to the neighborhood strength work as the greatest example of how we're giving power and voice to communities to determine investments in their community and to really build a framework that is about organizing advocacy. And there have been conversations with our board because we're still sort of trying to show our board all that we can be as a community foundation and all the exciting things we can do as a community foundation. And I think it's very true for staff, and it's really starting to sink in with the board as well, that this is some of the most distinctive work that we can do as a community foundation and as a grant maker. And it's about community leadership. So it's about us being a real presence in community, not just being a grant maker to nonprofits, but being a partner with residents. And it's about giving residents a new opportunity to have the leadership role in their community. And for us, it's opened a lot of doors. It's gotten us so much more recognition and some household name value in Crown Heights, which has been incredible. And I think it just continues to show that we can do exciting investments and relevant investments outside of a traditional framework.
Great. Anybody else want to just share a story about having that tough conversation with a board member or a donor? Teresa, you look like you might have something to say.
So because I came into a fairly traditional foundation as a community organizer, I think there have been a lot of really difficult conversations. And I think the most important piece and what is that we stay in those hard conversations and that we continue to grapple with what are the ways that our institution needs to transform in order to facilitate this work, and the recognition that perhaps most of the work needs to be done at the institutional level in order to facilitate the kind of power building that we want to happen at the community level. And so I think it's about a commitment to staying in those hard conversations. I was really impatient. I think the first year and a half of this work, and I think at times impatient with our board, impatient that they didn't understand the political ramifications, or there's a lot of movement out of this idea that it's the right and moral thing to do, and we need to move out of this benevolence model and really understand how, and I think be better at doing the analysis and building the narrative around how this impacts all of us, and how doing this work is really about building in building power in communities, and in really facilitating a process where community folks can tell us hard truths that we need to hear, that's part of our being better, and a part of our growth, and the work that needs to be done at the institutional level. And so really, most importantly, is having those conversations. I think it was pretty shocking for the foundation, the first time the words white supremacy were used in that building. And now it's conversation that happens very regularly. It happens among the board members. It happens among senior staff. It's not unusual. And I think continuing to do that work and continue to stay in those conversations is one of the biggest expectations that communities have of us.
Great. Did anyone else want to add any other reflections on that question? Because if not, we're going to go to our closing question. Okay, so we're winding down. We just want to thank everybody for the great questions, and we didn't get to all of them, but we will follow up with some responses. We also encourage you to reach out to all of us, the speakers and the folks who convene this conversation directly, if you want to discuss these really interesting and important topics more. So to close the discussion, I was going to ask each of you, from what you've learned about this approach to philanthropy, what's one lesson you are holding on to in this moment that you would like to share with all of our colleagues that are in different positions in different organizations nationally? Cortez, do you want to start with your one lesson you'd like to share?
Sure. I think for me, it's mostly around transparency. I think transparency in grant making is immensely important, especially given the work that many of us are doing and the issues that many of us are working against. I think I saw someone in the comment talk about capitalism, and it's like, yeah, having transparent conversations around money, both where money is coming from and where money is going, and who are the people making those decisions, is immensely important, and something that I feel like is often missing from conversations around philanthropy.
Great, thanks. And Leanne, what's one key takeaway or lesson you'd like to share with all of us?
I guess I would say that not to underestimate your board, because I've seen our board of directors have some really great conversations around talking about the grants that have been recommended through a neighborhood strength process and defending those grants. And they haven't, similarly, they have approved every grant that has been made or has been recommended. But just to see them kind of stand up for the integrity of the process to each other and say, you know, this might be this grant may be complicated for us to make, but we should make it. So I've just been impressed by how quickly that took hold with our board.
I love that. Let's not be afraid of complexity or underestimate all of our ability to evolve and shift and transform. It's beautiful. Thanks, Leanne. And Maria, how about for you? One lesson or key takeaway you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the key lessons that we really learned here at Headwaters is actually to do a lot of evaluation. And so that actually looks like fairly informal processes that we've put in place. An evaluation that doesn't just sort of like end up in a report and then on our bookshelf, but that we actually take action on pretty instantaneously. So we ask a lot of questions our participants actually fill out surveys and they give us a lot of information. And oftentimes we're able to act on their feedback within the next meeting. And so I think what that does for us is it builds a lot of trust. They know that we're really here listening to them and that we value their leadership. But it's actually helped us to strengthen our process. And so now, you know, decades into it and also 3 cohorts into the Giving Project, we feel like we're doing better work, and that's being reflected in the information and questions that we're asking people to answer.
Great, thanks. And Teresa, you can wrap us up with some of your wisdom and insights around what you've learned.
So I've learned that our staff needs to move through a process that's really parallel to the process that communities are moving through. And as we're doing that, as we're surfacing our own equity issues that need to be addressed, I think we can really empathize with and understand better the struggles on the ground in communities. And I work particularly in rural communities, so folks don't have any kind of veil of anonymity to hide behind. They're often having these really hard conversations next to people that you know, their kids are on a soccer team with, or their next door neighbor, or somebody they sit next to in church. And so also bringing those same hard conversations into our staff places, and you know, so that folks who are dealing with finances are also struggling with how are we promoting or standing in the way of equity, and how do we remove some of those barriers. And so that work, that internal work, is really critical to achieving the kinds of outcomes that we'd love to see happen across the state.
Thanks, Teresa. Well, thank you all, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I'll speak on behalf of all of us to say that we are here and we are open and happy to discuss this in depth with all of you more. You can get in touch with me as part of my work with Shake the Foundations or the Be Initiative, or just as a person, because this is a really important conversation. I'm just really grateful to have explored it with all of you. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Caitlin.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you so much, everyone, for your expert facilitation and insights. For those who are still on the call with us, I wanted to, in addition to the credible models and featured speakers that we had today, some other notable models that we'll link to in our follow-up email to this call are shown on your screen. There's a rich community of practice in the sector that you can tap into and build relationships with to support this really powerful approach to philanthropy. And thank you all again. Thank you to our moderator, Jennifer, to our speakers, to our co-hosts and our co-sponsors who made this conversation possible. This webinar has been recorded, so you will receive a follow-up email in early September with a link to this recording and with a list of other resources for you to continue delving into this topic. And we invite you to stay engaged with us at NCRP. Join us in our movement to transform philanthropy, either as a nonprofit member or as a foundation supporter. Happy to get in touch with you on that. Once this closes out, please fill out the webinar feedback survey that will appear on your screen. And thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.